Welcome, Dylan, to the Classical Odyssey. I'm so happy that you accepted my invitation. We've met over New Masters Academy over the platform. You were a New Masters Academy student and also a teaching assistant. And I'm gonna try to make the introduction short because I want to give you as much time as possible to talk. You have a absolutely exceptional, fascinating life trajectory. And I could tell that from your drawings somehow. I saw the amount of detail and tediousness and how much of yourself you invest in your drawings, which are excellent. And I think you have an incredible future as an artist. But before I'm gonna continue with asking questions about you and about your story, I'd like you to maybe say a few words about where you are now in your artistic journey, and maybe when was the first time in your life when you realized that you have this artistic inclination?
Sure. Well, first off, thank you for all of the very kind words. Like you said, we've been kind of colleagues, I guess, in the past, and now I would say friends. It's been
Yes.
great knowing you, and I really appreciate the opportunity for the interview. It surprised me when you requested it, but I think we'll have a fun conversation and just having a nice opportunity to collaborate. Um, Hopefully, the first of many. And like you said, um, it's good to be here. So my name is Dylan. I'm not sure who's going to be watching this, but if it's people I know, hello, people I know. I'm a advanced student of arts and drawing, a little bit of painting. That's going to be a little bit more in my future because it's something that I'd really like to invest into, but definitely a lot more of the drawing. I've been studying full time or close to full time since about the start of COVID, and I'll talk more about how I got into as much of a kind of intense regimen as I've been doing. But that's more or less what I've been doing for the last 3 years. It's been very focused on moving forward in the arts. I think I've made some fairly good progress, and I'm proud of what I've done and where I've come from. Um, in terms of where I'm at, I've actually just come back from Italy, where I was a part of a couple workshops with New Masters Academy and Glenn Vilpu with Vilpu Academy. They are, I guess, they're my alma mater. um,
Which I will
and
ask you about later on, because I would like you
yes,
to talk a
yeah,
little bit more in depth about the experience, the European experience
yeah.
you've had, because you had
No,
two.
it was fantastic. There's a hint, but yes, like you said, this year I think if I was just kind of talk about where I've been at this year, it's actually been a pretty difficult year for me. It's
Mm-hmm.
been very atypical, and I've had a lot of, I think, unexpectedly difficult experiences, but also very new and very rewarding experiences. Um, and I think I've been a bit kind of out of sync up until actually like just the last few weeks. And I think that this past little trip in Italy was fantastic. And I think that it was what I needed to kind of sum up what I've been doing this year. And I'm at least where I'm going and what I'd like to be doing is really reinvesting with kind of full vigor and ambition into my education and my path as an artist, which feels a lot clearer. And I feel like my direction has taken on kind of a new shape. Well, maybe not a new shape, but a clarified shape. And I think what I would like to be doing and where I'd like to be moving has never really been more defined for me. And that a lot of the ups and downs that have happened this year have helped me create that direction, or like I said, clarify it to the point where I am very convicted. I think that's how I
Mm-hmm.
feel right now, and how I've been feeling maybe for the prior months of this year has not been anywhere close to that. There's been a lot of doubt, a lot of reflection. So it's kind of a fun place to be, I guess, as a student, even though there was a lot of
Definitely.
struggle
Mhm.
before it. But I like where I'm at, and I'm
It's
really
a very
ready.
exciting point as
Yeah,
well.
I think that there's a lot of potential. I think, like I said, I'm not brand new at this, and I've definitely advanced a lot of my skills to places that I'm proud of, and I'm excited to start using those skills for, more than just the sake of learning the language, but actually expressing myself with it. And I think I know what that means a lot more. Probably the best expertise that I could bring from an artistic perspective is as a student, and at least as my teachers have told me, I'm a fairly good one, at
Absolutely.
least when I'm not getting on their nerves. Um, but I think that
A
if there is anything I
positively
can
annoying
offer,
student is the best thing to
yes,
have
I
because
I
they're very,
am
very passionate.
definitely I'm definitely positively annoying. and many people are probably quite positive that I am annoying. But I like to think that I have a lot of passion and enthusiasm for it, and just am a little bit of a shit disturber, as they might say.
Yeah, that's
um,
amazing. I mean, I like what you said, the ups and downs, because I just wanted to have a brief mention, because we're often looking at the ups of life, that those are the motivators, when in fact it's the downs of life that are the most defining
yes.
moments that really have um, us question everything and calibrate our lives um, the way we
Yeah.
should, in a healthy way.
Well, I mean, I don't want to pull back the curtain too much, but we've chat before this, and we had
Yes.
a couple conversations before this interview to prepare for it. And I think one of the things that we really bonded about was our willingness to maybe accept just how extreme the human experience can be and how
Mhm.
low it can go, but also the potential space that exists within those extremely negative experiences. And at least for myself, when I talk about these things, especially when I don't know who's listening, I like to maybe be clear that it's not like I'm saying, we all need to be thrown into a pit of wolves and then the strong will survive or
Absolutely not.
something.
Yes.
This is not like a
Mhm.
might makes right philosophy or anything, but like you were saying, I think the greater the challenge that you can succeed is going to give you the most gains, and you're going to grow the most. But there's always that doubt when you're going through the challenge on whether or not you can succeed it, and lots of people don't, right? So like I said, this is not a might makes right thing where we're just accepting all of the depravity of human existence, but
Mhm.
rather accepting that that kind of events is going to happen to all of us to varying degrees, and we're all going to have our own personal nadirs and voids and what have you, that we have to deal with and come back from. And I think that this year, artistically, at least for me, there was a lot of doubt that I was struggling with immensely earlier this year. But I am at a period of kind of excitement and conviction, and it's a good place, like I said.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, that's you have this term in science, the walking on the edge of chaos.
yeah,
Just chaos theory. It's something that a lot of us experience in life many, many times, and
yeah,
this is, as you said, you need to walk with danger or this huge pressure, because when you come out of it, it's so forming for your character. And all the immaterial things in our lives are the most important ones. They're the ones that last. You can have material gains in short time, with, let's say, a more comfortable life, or you can have these immaterial gains that could allow you to achieve greater things. And yeah, I really liked what you mentioned before. It's a very deep statement that the human experience can take extreme forms. And sometimes we feel like we cannot have anybody else around us, or nothing in the literature, nothing in our real life that we can relate to, that can be even remotely similar to what we experience. But in the end, when we manage to balance our lives, when we talk about it, it feels paradoxically like the more individual and the more unique our experiences, the more relatable and
yeah,
helpful it is for everybody else when they hear. So
yeah. It's the idea of a universal theme, but maybe not a
exactly.
universal event, right?
Hmm.
And I think that those universal themes oftentimes reveal themselves when we stop, or rather when we have to rationalize something that's so unique that the only thing that we can really connect to anything else is that theme within, but that the events might be so unique and so personal, that there is no common ground between another event and that one. And I think that one of the things that we talked about, and we can go maybe back to my larger story in a second, but one of the things that we talked about is that really I approach art from more of a literary place. And one of the things that I find that literature does quite well is explore those very extreme themes, and I think try to maybe not even rationalize, but place them in the human experience in a way that's accessible for, I mean, anybody that's willing to engage with the work. And um, there's no shortage of authors who have tried to rationalize or explore what is to many people inexplicably evil or immoral or difficult, and that maybe that's we're talking about a drawing podcast and being a drawing student, but um, I think that's maybe just the kind of person I am, and I think about that kind of big picture stuff, and I feel very connected to that kind of conflict, and uh, that's also how I kind of approach, at the very least, what I would like to be doing in my ambition with the arts is, like I said, it's very literary, and it's more about the idea of meaning and communication, and not necessarily aesthetics, which I think is maybe atypical for a lot of people that are focused specifically on a lot of traditional craft, which I do really enjoy. But and I'll talk about this in a bit. But I find that actually the intersection of what I might say throughout this interview as literary meaning, and hopefully we can also expand a little bit on what I think that is,
I
and
really like what you
traditional
said. I'm sorry
craft.
for because it's so true, and that's what I really got excited about when we first talked. Because in my opinion, as well, I think you have to start with the meaning first, and the purpose of the arts is that they all converge towards the truth. And I think the truth delivered by means of the word is the most important one because it doesn't appeal to the emotions first. Everything that we consume with the eyes first um, creates an emotional response, triggers an emotional response. Whereas when you read the word, you process it with your mind first. It has this intellectual filter, and then it goes to the emotions. So it's a lot more processed in a much deeper way. So I think this is a point where we completely agree, and I think
Mm.
this is the ultimate purpose of the
I
arts.
I think as well what you're saying there is I think I definitely agree about the idea of meaning. One of the things that I might stake maybe a greater importance on is actually what you were saying is that appealing not necessarily to the emotions, but I think of it more as appealing to the senses. That the idea that there is a way in which we interpret it, and maybe I step back from emotion because that feels like it's kind of like an overpowering experience, or it's something that's kind of irrational. And I don't
Mm.
necessarily think that the senses are irrational, right? I mean, what we see is usually what is there, and obviously, there's no slew of artists that play with that to an extraordinary degree. But I'd say that overwhelmingly, what we experience commonly is shared material. And one of the things that traditional crafts, when we're talking about traditional crafts, it's really kind of looking at the Renaissance forward and Western European art based on kind of Renaissance ideas, but also lots of stuff coming afterwards. It's about the idea of creating something that feels like an extension of the real world. So it's not so much as just kind of a symbolic representation, but it's the idea of actually creating something that we believe to be real, and we believe that it's real based on our relationship with it because of our senses. And it's obviously sight in this case. Um, but that process actually, if you ask me, creates the potential for such a personal and immediate kind of relationship to whatever literary meaning might exist, that the subtext of the work, or the message, whatever you'd want to call it, that by having that moment of actually appealing to the senses, we feel that what we are seeing is inarguable, right? We see it as an extension of our space. We see it as an illusion, as some of my teachers call it. And I think it's a really good word because, I think the illusion is something that we accept as unreal, but we believe it to be real. And when we know it's an illusion, we know it's not real, but that doesn't change the fact that we still participate with it as if it was. And that's very different from a lot of, and this is kind of nitty gritty craft stuff, but it's actually very different from literally the methodology of artists later on and how they approach things. Usually, impressionism and forward, but there's a lot of that kind of thinking that starts to emerge after the Renaissance. I mean, right into the Baroque, they start to deal with that stuff, but um, it's that idea of creating something that we literally believe to be real. And when that is the foundation of a message or some kind of thematic, literary kind of meaning, our relationship with that message or thematic meaning then becomes more personal and more based on how we might actually experience that thing in reality. So we're participating with it, I think, at a more intimate degree. And again, I have no shortage of love for literature, but part of what makes literature, I think, difficult to have that kind of emotional persuasion, I guess you could say, is that it's almost entirely reflective. It's something that we think about and something that we reflect after reading, right?
Oh, yeah,
We don't
exactly.
necessarily experience it as we read. We read and then we reflect on it. And you can just take the idea of a sentence in general. And some people play with this, where what's revealed in a sentence is kind of, ordered in the way that you
Mm.
want to experience it. But largely, most writers aren't stylists to the point where they're dramatically considering that to be the foundation of how they're communicating everything in their book, right? Or whatever the work happens to be. And
Yeah, the arts are supposed to be complementary. I mean, in the
yeah,
process of
exactly. And I
creation, you cannot
definitely think
separate
that.
them.
Yeah.
We depend on the other arts as well.
Yes.
You have a very, very well-formed opinion that is not only the result of a lot of reading and a lot of reflection, but also a result of experiencing life with a lot of lucidity and a lot of wisdom, which I was really impressed about. And I wanted to ask you first, if you don't mind, when did you start having this awareness of the fact that you have an artistic inclination? How did it happen? And how did it change your life later on?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can just kind of start at the beginning and give you the story of Dylan as well as I can give it in a shorter kind of format. But I'm only 25 years old, so to everybody listening, take what I say with a grain of salt. I know I'll probably listen to this later on and be like, "What the hell was I saying?" But not to discredit me too much.
It's
I'm
not youth, but
obviously
wisdom.
very
That,
smart and humble. um, but I think I've always been a bit of a fussy person, to put it slightly, and I had a very I was a chaotic child, and I was always kind of artistically inclined, creative kid and doing stuff like that. I was painting and drawing. I liked doing it when I was younger. It was one of those things that people told me I was good at, so I did it more when I was younger. I didn't really do it as a teenager, so my kind of period of doing stuff as a kid was more when I was, a little kid and just drawing with crayons or whatever. And then kind of when I was 10 to 12, I actually was taking painting classes, oil painting classes with a very good friend of mine now. And she was just a neighbor down the street. She was in college and taking painting classes, and I'm pretty sure my mom just dumped me with her, and for babysitting, teach Dylan how to paint type of thing. I'm sure there was more structure to it than that, but it wasn't. It exposed me to a lot of the opportunities I think available, and it kind of lodged in my head that this is something I like, and I think that happens to all kids. Our environments dictates a lot of what we end up interested in, and for me, it was that kind of reciprocity of people telling me I was good at it, so I did it more, where I was interested in it more. But really, it wasn't until after high school that I was seriously investing into art. And like I said, when I was a teenager, I didn't really do a lot with art at all. I was just kind of messing around as a doing nothing as teenagers do. Um, and then after high school, I kind of had a period of like nothing. I wasn't really doing much, and um, I I wanted something to learn, something to do, and I decided to learn to draw because, like I said, it was this thing that was always in the back of my mind that I liked or I wanted to do more seriously, and I decided to try. My entire education I actually saved for these past 2 weeks, where I've been in Italy, and I'll talk about that more. It's been entirely online, so I'm an online student through and through. Um, and I started with a resource called Drawbox, which is a great free drawing resource. They do kind of a dynamic sketching, kind of an iteration on dynamic sketching. I did it back in 2017, a little bit in 2016 when I was just kind of looking around and poking at things. But then 2017 came around, and I guess New Year's resolutions held for me that year, and I kept going with it. So I did that through 2017 as a hobby, just for fun. And then in 2018, I was like, I've built a lot of kind of experience with this, and I'm having fun with it, and I want to keep going. So I started looking into more resources after that, and I did Procol on YouTube, as I think everybody online does at some point. And but very quickly after that, I was exposed to Glenn Vilppu, the man, the legend, and I'm very fortunate to say my teacher. I've studied with him personally now for 3 years, but in 2018, I was exposed to Glenn, and when I saw him drawing, it was just a moment of like, why? What am I doing if I'm not studying with this guy? Because it was, I think it was the first example of like real mastery I had seen somebody put forward in kind of a live situation, just kind of a random drawing demo. And from there, I was exposed to New Masters Academy as well. And like you said, we met through that community. And I was kind of studying still as a hobby through New Masters from 2018 to 2020. And then, as we all know, in 2020, COVID hits and kind of shut everything down. And that was kind of another period of my life where it was kind of a transition, I think, between what I was doing beforehand and whatever phase it was to dealing with this kind of new situation. And I was let go from my job. It was temporary at that point, for COVID, and I was at home and I didn't really have a lot to do. So I decided, like, I'm never going to have a better chance to do this seriously while I'm still young than this period of a couple months that then was turning into years. And I said, why not? And I was very fortunate. I think that a lot of my story is defined by luck more than anything else. And I was very fortunate that I'm from Canada, and Canadians were given an emergency response benefit during COVID. So I was not immediately pressed to find work. And, I wasn't stressed for money and a place to live. I was living at home, and I still live at home. So again, it's an enormous resource that a lot of people don't have. Um, and I don't know, I got my shit together. Basically, I started studying full time, and I think having the confidence to know that I had money to support me in classes, and that's when I also started with Dylan Pym Academy in January of 2020, and it's October of 2023 now, and it feels like that was just yesterday. COVID really has totally affected how I see time, but I did that for at least 2 years, full time study and investing seriously, and it paid off. And I learned a lot, and it changed my life. Really, I became very close with the new masters community, and I've done professional work with them in a few different capacities at this point. I've gotten to know many teachers, instructors, coaches, community members. I've built friendships, relationships through this online community, and um, I did that for about 2 years, and then this year, at the end of last year, I was not feeling burnt out, I guess, but I guess I felt that direction was kind of getting lost a little bit. I felt like I had this kind of explosive period where I moved forward with a lot of skills, with gusto and determination, but I was starting to confront more what I actually wanted to be doing with art, and I think asking myself some of the bigger questions, which was good, and that led me to um, actually planning a trip to go to Europe for the first time, to do the grand tour, as they
Yeah, I was really
say.
looking forward to hearing from that event, because
Yes.
it seems to be like an
Yeah.
an
So the
existential
grand tour for
crisis.
me. So I've talked about it with a few people, and I'm curious if maybe some people have been curious just in my own life about how I felt about it, because I've actually not talked about it a lot. And part of the reason for that is that I found it to be a very emotionally difficult experience for me. And it was a process of confronting a lot of what I don't like about art, ad
Interesting.
nauseum for 2 months.
Before you talk about your actual
Yes.
experience, I wanted to ask you about what were your greatest questions? What was the crisis? How would you define the crisis that you were experiencing? Like, as an
Crisis is
artist,
such
was it an
an
identity
extreme word,
crisis
but
per
yeah.
se? Was a larger than life thing, or your question?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's varied, and to be honest, it's been an active relationship. I think just before a little bit, before I left for the trip, and up until these last couple of weeks, and I kind of feel like these last 2 weeks were it was everything I needed to kind of let go of a lot of that conflict, and like I said, to have that kind of conviction moving forward again. But I went with a lot of excitement, and I probably had high expectations. But I think that what I was expecting was that seeing art in its original context, which I'll put an asterisk
So the
on because
sole
I don't
purpose of the trip
necessarily.
was just to travel around Europe and see the most famous art
Yeah,
galleries,
it
see
was to go and expose myself to
the
the
works
real
of your
context
favorite masters.
of all of these people that
Mhm.
I've been studying and appreciating and learning more about. Because anybody who's from the greater Vancouver area in Vancouver can tell you we have none of that. It's not there. And I didn't want to just like drive to California to go to the Getty or something. So I did a big Europe trip for 2 months, from April to June, halfway through April to near the end of June. And I met up with some people during the trip as well, and that was kind of my first taste of that as well. But the purpose was, to build a personal relationship with these pieces, and hopefully, at least what I was expecting, to have a more powerful experience from the arts, and I think to really understand the potential of what this kind of traditional craft can achieve. And if we
What
want to
was
get
the
right into it,
geographical trajectory? How did
geographical
you?
trajectory, I
Yes.
can tell you it exactly because I've said it so many times. I went to London, Paris, Amsterdam, Prague, Vienna, Munich, Venice, Florence, Rome, and then Athens, and then a very brief stop in the English countryside to go say hello to a friend, and then I
Amazing.
flew back home to Vancouver.
Amazing.
Um, yeah, so that was the trajectory. I think it's 11 cities that I went to, and I mean I went to most of the greatest hits. I think Spain is maybe the only country that I didn't make it to. Um, but I went to most places for almost a week, and then a couple places was just kind of 3 or 4 days. But I had a significant amount of time to go over all of this stuff, and it was also my first experience traveling alone, so that was a formative experience as well. It wasn't as difficult, I think, as everybody tells me,
Was there
because
a lot of planning involved, or did you
there was a
make it?
lot of planning, yeah, and a
Yes.
lot of people helped me with it as well. I
Mhm.
had friends, put together like itinerary for me. Shout out to other Dylan, as he's known. He helped me with a lot of the planning, and I was very appreciative of that. But lots of people were giving me tips and recommendations and places to go, and I obviously couldn't get to everything, but I had a laundry list of things that I could have done, and I kind of picked. I mean, really, I only had time for the biggest stuff, right? So I
It's
went
very
to
difficult to be selective.
yeah,
Yeah.
and what I realized actually, if I was to do it again, and I would like to do more travel, I would go to one place for a long time. I wouldn't go to many places
Mhm.
over a long time. I think that, especially if you're looking to build kind of a personal relationship with art, at least for me and the way that I was experiencing it, I would prefer more time with specific things and not just kind of a greatest hits thing.
Yeah, that's a very good recommendation.
Yeah, so maybe, if people are listening to this and they're like, hey, I kind of get along with this Dylan guy, that's how you might enjoy your Europe trip too. But anyways, if we wanted to talk about the larger Europe trip, and I think how it was making me feel about art, because I think it's actually a good launch pad into what I do value about art and what I believe.
So the expectation was to have this deep experience
Yeah.
when seeing face to face, let's see, the
Yeah, what I was
masterpieces. Yeah.
expecting, maybe this is a good way to put it. What I was
Mhm.
expecting is that I was expecting kind of the difference between um, just kind of listening to music on Spotify or whatever and going to a live performance, right? Is that those are very different situations, and you can enjoy both of them by all means. But I know that when I've had fantastic live musical performances, like it is transcendental, or it's as closest to transcendental as you can get, for me at least.
Mhm.
And it's at least transcending anything between me and the arts. I don't know about anybody else in the crowd, but I usually have a great time, and I've only been to a few live performances, and it's really special. And I was hoping that there would be that kind of dichotomy between looking at things online or in books and going to museums. And I think what I found, and is that I didn't have that. And I didn't actually find that this trip that I had in Europe was an experience of affect, so to speak. It wasn't something that I felt. It was very intellectual, it was very reflective. And I think that the biggest struggle that I was having is that I've been investing so much into this craft and this direction for myself. And what I found was kind of a lack of connection with the work in any capacity that wasn't just the person who studies this kind of esoteric form of craft, right? I mean, esoteric in terms of exposure, but uh, the only real way I was connecting with the art was as a craftsman, not as a person. And I found that was very demoralizing. And it was heartbreaking, because I expected something, I think, a lot more powerful, because I was kind of comparing it, like I said, in my head, to this difference between, the first time I was seeing live music, which actually wasn't until 2022. It was my first concert. And it's still one of the best experiences I've ever had, especially artistically. Um, and I was hoping for something, I think, to that level of difference, and maybe it was unreasonable, but I think that, yeah, I was talking to a friend last week about it, actually, and I told her that, I don't necessarily know that it was high expectations as much as that it was I expected to feel something,
Mhm.
and that not having that quality in my trip, like I said, it was heartbreaking. And a lot of those times I would come back from museums on my trip, or I was out in Europe, and I found the experience to be kind of monotonous and very sullen at times, and I was kind of waiting for things to start. And it was 2 months, so it was very long, and I had a lot of time to, I think, kind of
Mhm.
be grumpy and miserable about it.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
really curious about asking because I remember when you talked about it for the first time, you were describing the environment that influenced you most, the environment in which those pieces
yes,
were
so
displayed. Was it
this is
sterilized?
part of it.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was
is
devoid of.
that I talked about, very briefly, I kind of started this, and I used specific words, in that I wanted to see art in its original context. And largely that's not possible, because you're going to see these paintings that are now hung in galleries that are overcrowded in terms of how many paintings are on a wall. The spaces are not really cultivated to appreciate the picture. They're a lot more like museums, which, that might sound like the same thing, but a museum is more like, it's more like, a storage room in a way, right? It's showing you stuff that did exist, but it's not trying to get you to pretend that you are in ancient Greece with these little Cycladic miniatures or something. It's just showing you what they are, and there's going to be text blurbs about it. And obviously, that's not true for everything. I went to churches and chapels, and there's lots of public spaces, and I would say overwhelmingly I enjoyed those things more than galleries. But part of what's frustrating about that is that my favorite art is not in those places. So my favorite stuff I could not really see in its original context. And I think it required a lot of effort on my part that I was probably unwilling to give because I felt like I was owed a little bit more. And again, you can say that's unrealistic or, it's childish, but I was not having the best time. And that I kind of had to role play if I wanted it to work, and I think that I found that kind of tiring, and it was very disappointing because I was also thinking to myself, if I'm going to be making this stuff, am I really expecting people to be engaging with my work in a way where they have to pretend they like it to like it? Like, and that just it felt so cold, and to be honest, it felt kind of elitist in that sense, where
It
it's
sounds
like
like you were questioning the question of the question, so you went
yes.
quite deep with
So maybe again, it's overthinking it. But like when I think about art and its potential, I'm definitely thinking like I want my art in people's hands. That's kind of the ambition. I want people to be touching it. I want them to be engaging with it, and that's how I like engaging with art as well. So I mean, live music, right? Well, that is the context. The whole environment is set up to make this thing work. And some churches and some places are, and some of them are fantastic. Most of them are tourist traps, and you're going to be around 1,000 people that are only there to take pictures, and they don't care about how much you might care about it, and they're not really there for the same reasons that you are, which is going to be normal. I mean, you can go to maybe your favorite band in the world, and there's going to be lots of people there that only kind of mildly like them, but at the same time, the environment there is set up to support the people that want to get really into it, right? There's going to be, depending on the kind of music you're going to, there's going to be mosh pits, there's going to be, all sorts of stuff happening that is for the people that want to be getting into it. And there's not really the ability to do that with work in galleries.
That's one of the
Uh,
downfalls of like making things such as tourism
yeah,
a banal thing that everybody does it, and you
yeah,
don't know how much the people around you influence you, even though you don't
yeah.
know them, you've never spoken a word with them. It's just
Well, you
the
just think about how loud it gets, how intrusive
exactly.
physically it gets. People start bumping up against you. I mean,
Mhm.
like in some of these places, I had people put their hands on me to move me out of the way of pictures, and it's
That's
like,
terrible.
that's like, like it was ridiculous what kind of stuff happens in these places, and people are just so nonchalant about it.
It's the
So
sacred and
that
the
that
profane and one
yeah,
colliding.
that's more of Dylan the misanthrope just whining about tourists. But I think that fundamentally the way that, at least for me, in my opinions, the way that we are preserving art in this capacity is very divorced from how it actually could be affecting and the kind of experience it would be engaging, uh, or the kind of experience that it could be creating. That's this very powerful and meaningful thing. And I think that's also how I approach art as a very meaningful, a very important, and very powerful societal institution, right? And I think that this is kind of evidence of not seeing that potential, at least in this piece of the arts, which would be, painting, sculpting, drawing, this kind of thing. And I think that was kind of the most heartbreaking thing, because what I was thinking to myself was, even if I make this, it's not going to matter. And that was really hard to deal with, because if I couldn't even really enjoy the experience, I felt like it was very difficult to expect other people to engage with that. And I think that since this trip that I went on, which I have since, I've reflected on for months and months, and I've had new experiences with art. And like I said, I've returned to Europe. This is the second volume. Um, that's I have maybe different perspectives. I think that I still hold on to that opinion, but I think I have more optimism about how that can change, and also how uh, this craft that is really only preserved in these galleries, at least in terms of my favorite parts of that craft, how that can be used in ways that I find to be very meaningful and, dare I say, contemporary. I know that's maybe, a contentious word, but I'm not really coming at it from any kind of specific political or social or philosophical perspective. I'm just saying, in the context of modern living, obviously we have different expectations, and we have
Absolutely.
different I mean, we have different sensitivities is maybe a good way to put it, right? I mean,
Exactly.
one of the things that I did in Italy last week, is that with a Glenn Vilpers group, we went to, God, I can't remember the name, but we went to a smaller museum in Florence, and on the top floor are the dormitories of monks who lived in this place. I guess it used to be a church. And one of the things that I said to a friend is that, you know, it's so difficult to actually understand what paintings were in a time, even just before photography, where in a time where we didn't take imagery for granted. And then you go into these dormitories and you consider the deeply religious society, that the meaning of these works is incredibly personal, theoretically, at least for the people in there, for the monks that are true devout, but maybe not for the ones that are just there for a free meal or something. um, that they have a single image in their dormitory, and they just spend their time almost perpetually contemplating it in the context of their lives and their studies, which was very insular, and that's not necessarily the best thing, and it's not what I'm arguing for. But think about the importance and presence that that kind of imagery has in somebody's life, and how significant it is to have that visualized. Um, and then again, attaching to that idea of this traditional kind of perspective of representational art being an illusion, that this is also these artists' attempt to realize the spiritual for these people, to realize this thing that they believe in so intensely, that is greater than themselves, that is this kind of guiding first principle. And while I'm not a religious person, I would probably consider myself very spiritual and very concerned with, as we were saying, these kind of universals, or these maybe sort of transcendental things. I kind of chafe with the word transcendental because I find a lot of people that use it almost have like a domineering ambition that if they can make the transcendental thing,
Yeah,
then
I
they can
understand.
they can get past it all. But I find it more as the idea of getting past the barriers of doubt, so to speak.
Because truly, you try to materialize the unseen as an artist. You want to grasp.
Yeah,
Yeah, I use this expression. You want to grasp the transcendent substance of reality, because there's something immaterial that
yeah,
is inherent to all reality.
yeah,
That's what makes us spiritual and relate to reality in a spiritual way as well,
yeah,
not just through our senses. And it's very difficult as an artist to do so, but that's what we try to do as artists all
yeah,
the time, because in the end, we're not just merely describing reality, but we're telling a story about something that is above it somehow
yeah.
in
Well,
importance.
there's a deeper primer impulse for the
Yeah,
entire institution and collective pursuit of the arts. And I think that the idea that it is nothing more than a series of abstract components which we can play with like toys is, at least for me, it's not serious enough. And that maybe that's not, maybe that's too convicted for a lot of people, but I find that, and actually where I came from with art in general was from this place, and that I wanted to communicate more deeply. And that I actually, one of the things that's maybe worth mentioning is that I also study writing, admittedly not as much as a art at the moment, but that is part of my ambition and what I would like to do with my life. And my desire and the actual pursuit of studying drawing, traditional drawing, came from writing. And I was writing things and I was trying to visualize them with drawing, and I just kind of looked at it and I said, like, why am I not learning to draw? And that was kind of the start. So you asked me that question earlier, and there's a better answer to it. And for me, um, I take it very seriously in terms of its potential, and I think also my ability to affect the world in what I believe to be a positive way. That there is a moral component to my motivation, and I think for a lot of people maybe that's not the case, and that's not a judgment against those people. But I do find that that might be a place where I disagree with a lot of people, or maybe I don't have that kind of same perspective. A lot of people are maybe looking just for professional kind of situation. They want to get a job, or they want skills to just kind of have fun, or I mean that sounds pejorative, like I'm making fun of them. That's not the point. I just find that I have this kind of socially motivated perspective of the arts,
mhm.
and that I did say that I wasn't necessarily coming from a social perspective when I was saying contemporary or anything, but I definitely am motivated in a very traditionally artistic way of wanting to affect positive change in the world in this artistic endeavor, in however that manifests.
So you had a second trip in Florence. That
Yeah,
was also a
yeah.
new Master's Academy with Glenn Vilppu's academy as well.
Yes. So it
And
was New Masters
why
Academy
was it
and then Vilppu
redemptive in a
Academy.
sense? Because it sounded like it was the redemptive
Yeah.
experience, but
So I think
change
that
a
for
little bit the
myself,
perspective.
yeah, of course. I think that for myself, actually, there is one trip that I should mention that was actually before this one. I've had a year of travel. That's what I did this year. I spent all of my money, and then I'm going to get home and just not go anywhere for the next 600 days. Um, is that I was actually in New York for 5 days before I left for Italy. It was like right before, and it was totally unrelated to at least drawing and painting and sculpting and my education. I was going with a friend to see a series of concerts, and it was actually very important to me. And I didn't realize how much that trip was going to matter in the context of, I think, because I was just mentioning live music. Well, this is kind of why I've been thinking about live music, because these concerts were so important to me, and I think that feeling that kind of rich artistic experience and that kind of emotionally persuasive and yet still, as we were saying, kind of literarily significant, that's a hard word, literarily significant events, it was very helpful to remind me why I started and what I wanted to be doing here. And I remember just coming back from the first night of those concerts. For anybody interested, I saw Run the Jewels. I actually have the T-shirt on, coincidentally, that I
Amazing.
got at the concerts. But I saw Run the Jewels for 4 nights, so it was like a mini festival of just them. And for anybody that knows them, they're a very braggadocio, crass hip hop group. You might not expect that to be what I went to see, but I think that I'm a very uh, kind of counterculture person in terms of impulse. And I think having that experience of what a lot of people might consider to be very lowbrow, crass, crude kind of artistic experience that was nevertheless supplying this very intense emotional experience. And we were on our feet, we were in the mosh pit, like it was awesome, and it was one of the best artistic experiences I've had. That I came back from that trip. I think I came back from that trip with the conviction to figure things out, and that I knew that I wanted to be pursuing something artistically, and even if it wasn't
A
exactly what I
pretty
thought it
rugged
was going to be.
experience compared to
Yeah.
going to Florence.
Yes. So then,
So
immediately after that trip, I'm headed back to Italy. And I'm sad to say, Italy was actually my least favorite country that I went to on my own trip. And part of it was the tourism. Is that it's been so changed by tourism, and I really feel for, I think, the people that live in Italy, because I can't imagine what it's like to just have everything revolve around people that don't live there, and don't really treat the place with that much respect. But I think going with the understanding that, first of all, I knew that I probably wasn't going to love everything that I saw artistically, but also that I was going for community reasons. So the reason that I was in Italy, just to be explicit about it, is that I was going for 2 workshops. One of them was with New Masters Academy, led by Joshua Jacobo, who's a teacher of mine, and he's a huge influence on me. He's given me no shortage of love and interest and motivation and instruction. I was his assistant for close to a year, and I got to know him, I think, fairly
that's
well,
how
at
we
least as
met,
a
actually.
teacher.
When
Yes,
I
so
tried to interview
that's
him
how we
for the
met.
first time.
I was helping with some tech support, and Josh was done an interview on this channel as well. And he's fantastic. And the workshop and
Amazing.
meeting him in person was obviously, it was so
Amazing.
nice, and I had such a nice time with him, and he was incredibly generous, and he was very compassionate. Like, he was just a really nice guy to meet. I have no shortage of things to say, um, nice things to say about him or the workshop. And I think going for this community reason to connect with these people that I've been studying with, and also to connect with many teachers. There were a few other teachers there that I'd never met in person before. The great Catherine Bobkowski, I'm very happy that I could meet her. She was another person that I was an assistant for a while, and we've gotten to a friendly point. We're friendly antagonistic with each other,
Really.
but it's
Mm.
playful. She's fantastic, and part of the reason I bring it up is because, like, it felt like we were very good friends that had known each other for a long time, and I was blessed to have as much time with her in Italy as well. Obviously, I met Glenn Vilppu, who's been my teacher for many years, since January 2020,
It's amazing.
and his instruction has been, I mean, probably unparalleled in terms of influence. I think anybody that looks at my work can tell that I'm a Vilppu student.
Absolutely.
And I have no shortage of things to say. I think that if you are pursuing traditional drawing, this is just maybe the little advertisement I'll put into this interview. If you're pursuing traditional drawing and you're not looking at Glenn's resources, whether that's on New Masters or Vilppu Academy or his book or wherever, what are you doing? Go and do that. Like it's the gold standard
Yes.
for figure drawing. It's the gold standard for traditional design as it's been kind of maintained in a contemporary space. And I mean, he's a true master, right? Like he's 87 years old. He has an entire, he's got careers and careers behind him. And he actually talked with me and a friend of mine when we were in Italy for a while about, all the things he kind of got up to. So all of that stuff was just emotionally significant for me, and I was very happy to be doing that. But I also found actually that a lot of the instruction in these workshops, and I think viewing things without that kind of prejudice of like, I have to like this or I have to make something of it, helps me make more of it. And it kind of took the edge off. And I think as well, understanding that I wasn't going there for this kind of experience of affect. And I will say, for instance, that of all of the art we saw, it wasn't really emotionally moving, and it was nice to have been in that New York trip and kind of juxtaposing that kind of experience with what we did in Italy. And I also think that it's unreasonable, for instance, to expect like the exact experience of live music in any kind of other context. But for instance, like I know what it feels like to read great literature and be deeply and profoundly moved by it, and I haven't really had that experience with at least being in those galleries.
That's amazing.
On
How
my
much do you
own.
think your inner predisposition of the time influenced you? Because I know you mentioned some very objective reasons why you would be disappointed, and
Yeah.
you are
Yeah.
very, you have the saying, the more lucidity, the more drama, the more tragedy, because the clearer you see the world, the more you will be affected in a negative way, because there's so much wrong in this world that you will, anxiety and depression, they're just like natural, let's say,
Well,
symptoms
there's
of
something we
realizing
all
how the
feel,
world works.
right? And obviously, and some of us feel them to a much greater degree. But
Exactly.
it is a common experience of the human experience. It's a common quality of the human experience. And I think that it was necessary for me to go and have a bad time and for me to move past it. And I think that this was a very privileged and I was very lucky to have this experience. I mean, obviously, people don't usually just get to go to Europe twice a year to kind of gallivant around with the arts. Like I said, a lot of what I've been able to do is because of luck and privilege. And that I think that not expecting things to go well is part of why things went well. And that I was actually pretty nervous leading up to it. And I was not necessarily super excited because I was worried, like, am I going to go here and kind of have a bad time and like cause arguments or something? But like I said, the instructors and the people there, they were very gracious. And I think they were very open to people not acting perfectly or, not wanting to work at the pace of everything. But that wasn't the biggest issue for me. I was just happy that it wasn't this kind of thing that I found to be very negative and that I was struggling with kind of in a group of people that were probably very positive. And part of the reason that I hadn't talked so much about my past trip is like, I didn't want to dump negativity on everybody, right? Like I didn't want to be like, oh, Dylan, how was your trip? And it's like, it was terrible. That's not fun. And it's also, that's my experience. That is my relationship with art, which is deeply personal. And it's only related to what I'm going to be doing with it. So if anybody wants to be doing all of the things that I just said I didn't enjoy, I don't have any judgment for that. Go and do it.
Absolutely.
there are people that connect with that stuff. What I found out is that I didn't, and that was what was disappointing. So if you are somebody that goes to these galleries and you break down in tears, I'm not judging you. That's awesome. I wish I could have had that experience. I didn't though, and I kind of had to rationalize that that's not what this is going to be for me. So we'll talk about, I think, what I'd like to do, and I think where a lot of this kind of traditional craft and the potential of it can lie with a lot of contemporary ideas, which I think is why we were going to have this conversation to begin with, and we've just started talking about.
This is really wonderful because there's so many experiences that come together because we can't experience the world in a, let's say, all-encompassing way. We need other people that perceive the world and understand it in its nuances that we don't even have the organs of reception that other people have, like to the level of their soul. And I have so many ideas that I would like to talk to you. I think it's gonna we're never gonna end because it's
we
about the
we could
meaning
go
of
for
art
hours and hours.
or
No, I
the
mean, hopefully, just at least just you and I continue to have conversations because I found it
absolutely,
very rewarding.
absolutely.
Um,
I wanted
but
to ask about
please,
how do you raise your stand? What is your standpoint now after the two European trips?
yes,
In terms of how do you see yourself as an artist, and what is the meaning of art for you?
the meaning
And
of
in
art.
terms of
You're
yeah,
asking me easy
the
questions.
greater purpose of I know this is it sounds really
Yeah,
ridiculous because it's so simplistic, but in the
yeah,
end you get there. You know, what's the
yeah.
meaning of art? What's the purpose of art?
Well, to be honest, I think that part of maybe where I do disagree with a lot of people is that I don't necessarily see art as a superlative, so to speak.
Mhm.
And I think that when people talk about art, I mean, well, okay, I did talk about art as a very important and necessary
Mhm.
institution, right? But that it's kind of different than calling something art as a superlative. And I see that kind of attitude go around where it's like, oh, this person was a craftsman, but this person was an artist. And to me, art is it's very simple in that it's not complex and that there is good art and there is bad art. And for something to be art doesn't qualify it for any kind of particular consideration. It just qualifies it to be art. And that doesn't give it a definition necessarily yet, at least from my paradigm. But maybe it gives you a perspective of my attitude in that I'm perpetually unimpressed.
Mhm.
But I think that art more or less is a combination of kind of individual expression. And I think that even when we're looking at very traditional, literally traditional kind of art, where it is a tradition that is being passed down through craftsmen, um, something that emerges is the inevitability of the individual. And that as much as you have these traditional movements and these kind of traditional lineages of craft, so looking at kind of the Renaissance master apprentice system, where obviously there's a very common kind of foundational language that's being used, but you still have Leonardo being different than Michelangelo, being different than Raphael,
Mhm.
um, being different than Del Sarto, being different than Tintoretto, being different than Titian, being different than Durer, and this is all within 100 years or so, and that this is also a period of time when that tradition was king, right? And that the way that you learned this and the culture that existed there, and this is what the first workshop was about, was that it was a craft and it was something passed down and created more like it was manufacturing a product, right? And you had people emerge that were really good at it, and they became kind of the artistic type that we think of now. But really, it had more to do with production and sciences than it did, and aesthetics than it did with our kind of current conception of art. But I actually think that our current conception of art is, at least what I would say, is more or less true. But that when we're looking into the past, it's that the craft plays such a larger degree in it. So part of the reason that I'm interested in traditional art, and I'll bring it back around to why you said, what do I think the purpose of it is that part of the reason I really like traditional art is that it's built on a common language. And it's not just built on a common language where we're talking about representation as a whole, which has obviously maintained through, since the beginning of time, beginning of art. We've been representing the natural world up until now. There's been no break in that. But in terms of the traditional craft being this kind of desire to extend the natural world, to create this illusion, to literally construct more of nature. That's kind of an impossible ambition, but as an ambition, like a guiding light, that's not necessarily what all representational artists are doing. And I mean, I would argue it's not the effect of what all representational art does, and that there is an amazing and rich and deep and totally interesting, and I love looking at it, kind of tradition that emerges like impressionism and illustration and more of this type of stuff. But it's not as much built on these tools, which again, you have to get really nitty gritty into some of it, which maybe I won't do because I don't want to bog down a lot of it, but the interview, but that it's not as deeply connected to that sensory experience of kind of that immediate persuasion of believing that this is part of your world, and that the way that facilitates communication is directly related to what I think arts, at least as a societal institution, is for, which is largely a form of communication. And it's a form of preservation of knowledge. I think that if you look at mythologies, for instance, which is the bedrock of art in many totally unrelated cultures, is that they are using their mythologies and their stories as the foundation for their art. Is that they are preserving knowledge in that in their art, um, in a way that is more compressed, that, as we've been saying or maybe hinting at, is more connected to kind of universal themes and universal ideas. And you consider, for instance, like verbal traditions or before writing, and the way that they had to encode knowledge into things and symbols to pass on to the people that would come after, so that their identities weren't lost and things didn't change immediately. I mean, obviously, that's a simplification of a much larger idea of society, but that this is part of that literal function of what art was doing, is that it had a very practical
Yeah, it
purpose.
has an intrinsic
Yeah,
role in yeah,
in that I think that
well-being
that
of
is
society.
true, but I also think that it is true that art is it is individual expression and it is the realization of one's individuality. But I think that when we're saying that, it needs to be elaborated on that it's not just visual arts that we're talking about. It is art as a
So,
human institution. So not just in terms of society, but in terms of a human impulse, is that it is a realization of ourselves. And I think that's true of any craft. I think it's true of any art. Um, and that the craft is the way that you realize those things, but that the art is the more transcendental part of it.
that's
So if you
very
were to ask
beautifully.
me, thank you. If you were to ask me, for instance, what I think art is for, or what my art would be for, it would be for the very same reasons. It would be for the preservation and communication of these things. A lot of traditional art, I think people that are interested in it, they're very concerned with aesthetics, they're very concerned with beauty. And for me, that has never been interesting and has never been a part of what I'm interested in. So justifying something for its beauty I don't care. It's not what I'm doing. But I think that if you look at traditional craft and its relationship to narrative and story and mythology, it doesn't take a lot to rationalize that it has been used for that for thousands of years. I mean, look at I don't remember what they're called, but the big Greek pillars in Rome that have the reliefs on them that are just stories of the various wars or mythologies they've used. I mean, they're using it to communicate history or
Like the
meaning.
Pantheon trees, yeah.
Yeah,
Jesus.
yeah, exactly. There's the Pompeii ruins and the frescoes, or I don't know if they're actually frescoes, but the murals that are there, and again, they're communicating stories. Giotto, who's arguably the first, or at least the most significant of the first Renaissance painters, he's telling stories. And I think that if we abstract that too much to the point where it's about beauty, and this is something that my teacher says, is that Glenn Vilpu, he'll say, nobody looks at Giotto because it's pretty. And I think that that is deeply related to what I would like to be doing. And I also think that it's happening as traditional craft was being created, right? If we're reviewing the Renaissance as kind of the start of that, and obviously ancient Greece and Rome is also kind of the start of that. Well, they were all doing narrative things, and I think that our understanding of narrative now has matured so much, but we've never really seen the intersection of kind of a contemporary understanding of literature or narrative and traditional craft. And part of that is because, in the 19th century, those skills were very much kind of devalued in a sense, or they at least weren't pursued as much. Modern art obviously interfered, and I'm not here to start a whole modern art conversation. Again, I don't really care.
We need another episode for that. Absolutely.
Yeah. But the way that illustrators started working was more in line with how people conceived of images through photography, and the way that they had to be commercially distributed, and there's a lot of simplification that starts to happen there, literally in terms of the finesse of the craft. So I think that where I see a lot of that potential and what I would really like to pursue, and again, like I said, this is a lot of bluster and big talk from who is still just a student with a lot of hope and ambition, but that I think we were talking very briefly before this chat, that we are in times of potential. And I think that having these conversations, even if I don't have evidence of it, is important because it gets people to think about things in a new way. And I think that nobody really, sees painting or imagery as grounds for great literary merit. And I would say that that is historically unprecedented if we're considering the purpose of these pictures and the reason that they were painted. right, is that they were for communication. Giotto's murals are literally just panels of a comic book. I mean, again, that's contemporary language, but I'm trying to get people to understand that the kind of a parallel is that they were panels of a comic book that somebody would walk through and talk about. They were the grounds of a story. And when we're talking about literature, for instance, and that other side of art that I do pursue very seriously and I believe in very seriously, well, I'm a very big fan of 19th century novelists, a lot of the modernists, Dostoevsky. God, I'm drawing a blank. This is the worst time to do it. Dostoevsky, Camus. I love Steinbeck and Kafka, and Cormac McCarthy is actually a really interesting writer that maybe I'll give a few words to. He actually just passed away while I was in my Europe trip, so that was another another point to be sad about while I was away. But I think that the way in which we understand literally humanity, that we perceive meaning differently now. We consider, for instance, Nietzsche's very famous quote, "God is dead." And a lot of people, I don't think, have read Nietzsche,
They
misquote
take it
it
completely
as,
out of context. It
yeah,
doesn't mean what
as
most people think it
exactly.
means.
And we kind of bonded about this, is that they kind of, use it as this like nihilistic anthem, as if it's this excuse to be a bastard or something, or that, you shouldn't believe or in anything or greater meaning or optimism or any kind of goal, like, again, just this kind of nihilistic anthem. And in reality, Nietzsche was saying this not necessarily even because he wanted to. Again, I haven't read every single thing Nietzsche's ever put out, but my read of what I have read is that he was saying it from a perspective that he was deeply troubled that society has moved on from the idea that there is any kind of presiding meaning. That when he was saying this, it was during a period of scientific revelation and revolution that so vastly matured our understanding of the natural world, through physics, psychology. That's an enormous one. I think people discredit how significant just the presence of psychology as a field has been, when we're talking about these kind of transcendental meanings. In that he was instead saying that metaphysics is dead, that if there is this kind of transcendental thing, and again, that's a deeply personal opinion, and how anybody might believe that is
And
up
also
to them,
the
but
tone in the context comes from the
it's a
depths of
tragedy.
despair. It's tragedy.
Yeah.
It's absolute tragedy. And then he
Yeah. And,
goes on
the whole
explaining what the
story of,
consequences thereof
yeah.
are.
And the whole story of Zarathustra is somebody attempting to overcome that, right? And that, that Zarathustra begins after, I think it's 30 years of solitude and this kind of contemplation and sullen reflection before he's discovered this meaning. So, I'm not recommending anybody to go read Zarathustra for some light reading or something. It's, if you want to, sure. But that Nietzsche was saying this from a perspective that our understanding of meaning is no longer established from a commonly accepted transcendental foundation, but instead that relativity is deeply involved with it, and that this first principle idea of what's worth cultivating is not as easy as just saying it's in our religious texts, or it's in our, it's in our mythologies, or it's in these patterns that we found. That all of these things are more greatly disturbed and affected by nature than they are necessarily totally and absolutely transcendental. Right. And that's also why I've been kind of being nitpicky with some of my language, because I am trying to own the experiences as mine. They're not anybody else's. And there's a lot of people that aren't going to have that. And I think coming from that perspective as well, painting has never really explored that from a narrative perspective. And our imagery hasn't really explored that from a narrative perspective. Our literature has. And I think that, again, it's not just that, we have paintings that have tragedies in them. That's not what I'm saying. I think that might be a shallow read of it, but instead it's the method of communication that is cultivated by traditional craft, which we're talking about as kind of Renaissance and forward, and how that creates meaning in its communication attached to these more modern literary ideas that I at least get the most excited about. And you can also probably imagine, well, it's like, well, of course, you wouldn't have been very connected to a lot of work, going through these galleries when it's not really done, right? There's lots of people that started to do that in the 19th century, but they weren't really doing it from a perspective of traditional craft. They were doing it more from kind of either impressionism or, kind of an academic impressionist kind of bend or illustration,
It's
and
actually
these
interesting
things
because
that were,
the focus started to shift more, not from leitmotifs or themes
yeah,
onto techniques and trying to apply new. It's probably also the appearance of photography that played a role in it. And I really
yeah.
like
Well,
what you
I
said.
mean, from what I understand, artists were, they had a crisis when photography came about,
Absolutely.
right? And
Hmm.
that was a it was a it was a theme of arts at the time, was what are we going to do about this thing? And I think a lot of people chose to retreat when, I think that, at least if you asked me, the real potential was not retreating, but it was showing just why photography can't do what we're talking about, in the same sense that journalism can't do what literature does, but that doesn't mean journalism is worthless.
That
Obviously
is
it's
a
not.
great analogy. That's
Yeah,
the
but
perfect analogy
also
to it.
what you'll find is that many of the greatest modernist writers were journalists. They were deeply concerned with nature as it actually was, not nature as an abstract idea, not nature as a model, but building models, to then affect with the nature that really was there. I mean, Steinbeck is one of my favorite writers because, I mean, he gets kind of a bad rap, I think, from people that are more literary because he's seen as simple. But I think part of the reason that Steinbeck is one of my favorite writers is because he was deeply concerned with communicating to people, and he was not concerned with stroking the ego of intellectual establishments. And I mean, people were like mad that he won the Nobel Prize, for instance. I think one of the judges even said that it was the best of a bad lot, and it's like, if he read these books, but when you're reading these books, he was a journalist, and he was focused very much on universal kind of uh, transcendental themes, but he was also deeply concerned with communicating them in a way that people who needed that kind of help and that meaning could connect with it. And I mean, Dostoevsky was doing similar things, still from a more intellectual point of view. It wasn't as common, at least from what I understand. I'm not Russian and I don't read Russian, but from what I've read about, um, and that Steinbeck was connecting to these things simply because it was effective and it was communication, and it was about getting those ideas to a greater amount of people. And I don't think there's any shortage of nuance or complexity available in the meaning of Steinbeck's works. And I think that as kind of a role model for communication, or Steinbeck as a role model for communication, is he's one of few that is probably unparalleled, right, in his ambition and what he wanted to pursue. And if you have read anything by Steinbeck, or you haven't rather, he wrote extensively about labor rights in the United States, and he was religious, or he had a varying degree of religiosity throughout his life, but he was connecting, for instance, very biblical and traditional kind of Christian themes to contemporary um, social issues, but not even necessarily in a way where the religious aspect was explicit. And I would even argue, for instance, that something like The Grapes of Wrath, and if you don't know this book, this is a spoiler, but The Grapes of Wrath is a novel that mirrors Christ's story, but using figures in kind of the social movements of Dust Bowl America, when, I mean, it was basically, if we were to talk about it with contemporary language, it was climate migrants put out of work and then subjected to slavery. Like, this happened in the 20s in America. Like, it's not fiction. And he nevertheless wrote about it from a literary standpoint, and he used, obviously, his journalistic ambition to make it more real, and connected all of those things to these more universal and designed themes. There's more composition to it, right? Journalism, you can only get away with so much before you just are making it up. And that I think that, again, talking about traditional craft as a form of communication, connecting to this literary tradition and this literary ambition, Les Mis and Victor Hugo talking about the French Revolution, Dostoevsky and the plight of the poor. And actually, if you've done any kind of a more deep research into Dostoevsky, revolutionary politics, a lot of really weird, interesting
I mean,
conversations
definitely,
about
art
that.
is often a reflection of the movements of society,
Yeah,
and I wanted to go back a little bit because there's so many amazing things that you said, very interesting as well. Um, it's very difficult to find this balance between the narrative and the lyrical, and I think the visual arts have a much more difficult task to do so, because in literature, obviously, you can be very descriptive, and
it's
in
the
the arts, it's
believable and
very
the symbolic.
exactly. In the arts,
Yeah,
you have to encrypt your message a little bit. You cannot be so descriptive as in literature, and therefore I was thinking if I was just thinking about how I see things myself, and I think what defines a great work of art is intellect, emotion, solidified worldview, and craft. And these are four big components to me that are the building stones of something that could be called a masterpiece. And I think the intellectual part, you have to first be able, have the capacity to, first of all, come from a place where you know there's a verticality to life. You have a worldview and a meaning in life. And then through the prism of that philosophy that you have, you can interpret reality, and then you encrypt it or decode it for the viewer. It can go both ways, inductive, deductive, And if you were to describe art yourself, visual arts, painting and drawing as a craft, what components would you add to this? Or do you agree or disagree with all these four: emotion, intellect, craft, of course, because I think this is very important.
Well, I mean, craft is the language, right? It's the thing that will actually get those things across. I mean, I think that's pretty good in general. I think that for myself, I see craft as the mode of communication. It's the thing that you need to refine to make complex and precise statements. That to articulate yourself, you need craft, and if you want to articulate yourself masterfully, you need masterful craft. But beyond that, you need to be probably a well-experienced, well-read, interesting, and in not necessarily intelligent, but rich individual. And craft can help you achieve those things. And I know that for myself, I am far more interesting and put together and proud of myself because of what I've learned being a craftsman. But at the same time, I don't think that pursuing craft endlessly is going to give you a mission, so to speak. It's not going to give you something to do. And, I said, for instance, that the reason that I started learning was because I had something that I wanted to do and I couldn't do it. So I think that if anybody is trying to connect with a deeper kind of meaning or motivation for just studying and just moving forward and achieving these things, there has to be something, I think, before just the act of doing things, or you become a kind of professional student. And that's actually, that's something that I struggle with, because I like the structure of, going through classwork or studying or doing these things that feel kind of careful or not careful, but controlled and easy to expect. Yeah, predictable. But one of the things that I've really been realizing this year is man, that's not how I want to spend my life. And as I'm so happy with the skills that I've built in terms of achieving those things, but absolutely I've been connecting more with that underlying mission and the quest and my ambitions and goals that are much greater than just, I'm going to draw a little better once I do this, and then I'll draw a little better. But also, at the same time, you don't have to pick. I also am somebody who's just I want to draw a little better just for my own satisfaction. I want to do it better, right? So, maybe you could criticize somebody like Steinbeck, for instance, in that he wasn't necessarily the most dogmatic craftsman. And he wasn't necessarily, I would argue people undercut just what he did for American prose style. It started with Hemingway, but if you didn't have Steinbeck, it would look very different. But he wasn't necessarily trying to become the most sophisticated craftsman you've ever seen in history. He was concerned with a much greater mission and pursued it with vigor. He made no shortage of amazing works. But for myself, at least, I think I've realized I like being a craftsman and I like refining this craft and I like doing those things. But in terms of the art, it's definitely more important. And that's what Europe, the first trip, taught me, right? Is that I needed more and I wasn't getting it here, and I was thinking about where to get it. And it was tough, I think, getting there. And there was a lot of months of not really doing much and actually being, very emotional and pretty low in moods and spirit and hope. And I'm very happy with the last kind of month and a half, and I think how it's reset my trajectory. Despite any of those nerves. If you're not going to study the craft, you're dead in the water. And that's what every modern artist, I think, got caught on, is that it was too abstracted to the point where a lot of these themes of relativity and these modern themes that were explored very well in literature were then kind of explored in an opposite way in more modern works that then ended up kind of defeating the ability or defeating the meaning in the process, because it wasn't really communicated. Also, I wouldn't be afraid to say most people treat modern art as a joke, and whether or not you enjoy
True.
it,
They
whether or
do have
not,
reasons for that. I mean,
yeah,
there's plenty of reasons to do
obviously,
so. But
it's a very
mhm.
contentious topic, and it's very, I mean, it's politically entangled with lots of things, but
It's also a term that is not very well defined because we have
yeah,
the commercial art that is
because
what
there's
we
modern art, there's postmodern art, and then there's,
exactly.
every different nation that was doing it, right? I mean, it's just like
So
Renaissance
modernism
art
is a
is almost
finite
difficult to define.
process, you know, like I often think about it. It's,
Yeah,
yeah, it's a
yeah.
term.
So, but I think that when people are talking about that, it's the abstract expressionism, right? People,
Mhm.
there's all sorts of jokes that can be made there, and um, I don't. Lots of people like it. Lots of people don't. I go both ways sometimes. There's stuff that I find interesting from kind of a decorative perspective, but you can probably tell it's totally beside my ambitions and interests. And the way in which I would appreciate it is it's not even really a part of this conversation.
I was just thinking about this Latin phrase primum vivere deinde philosophare, which means first live and then philosophize. And it's exactly what you said because I had almost 4 months. I wasn't very consistent with my drawing practice, but I did so much research. I've been traveling and I've been to places, and it made me think about things to a much deeper level. And it's so important that you experience life to its fullest as much as
Yeah,
possible. You invest in refining your character, you invest in refining your intellect, and all of these things together, these are the most important things that contribute eventually to your vision as an artist, because that's a portrayal of who you are as a person in society.
yeah,
And this is very, very important. And I think who's um, our listeners, they're really going to appreciate this view because it's so fresh. So many focus so much on I have to practice, 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 but then they don't
yes.
see any
I'm guilty of it too.
improvements.
So I'm not
Yeah.
coming here holier than thou. I'm coming here kind of with my tail between my legs in a way, right? Where it's like, man, I need more of this. And actually, one of the things I was just going to bring up, and before we end here, is like part of the originally when you said, "Hey, Dylan, do you want to do an interview?" and I asked, like, "Sure, why?" And you said, for instance, that you wanted to talk about like classical ideals and stuff, and like
Mm.
at first that kind of had me nervous. Cause like, man, I don't. That's not my thing. Like, that's not what I'm here for. But I hope that what at least I'm trying to communicate, and really the only way to communicate it is for me to put my nose down, do the work, and prove it's possible. And I hope I can do that. And I hope that maybe this interview people can look back on and say, hey, that guy did it. And maybe it's going to light a fire under my ass to prove myself right. But what I hope that some people can take from this is that there is so much more that you can do with art now, if you ask me, in terms of individual freedom, and I would even say just potential from a place of understanding, than maybe any point in history. What is lacking is the craft, and it's something that we haven't focused on as much as a society or a culture. But we've also never had the resources that we have now. And like I said, my entire education, if any of my work is worth anything, is online, and I haven't been in an in-person school. I don't have any debt. Part of the reason that I have been able to travel and do these things is because I have these fantastic resources of obviously New Masters Academy, um, and Vilpu Academy, and the internet in general, just privileges of modern living, um, that I hope that people start to find the ambition to do something new. And I find that a lot of people, when they're thinking about this stuff, they kind of have the ambition, or rather, it's not that it's a bad ambition. If you want to make a fantastic drawing and you just want it to be the most well-crafted thing ever, go ahead. And I love that stuff. And I've looked, there's no shortage of hours I've spent looking at Dürer's engravings or things like this that they're just amazing pieces of craft. And there is obviously some more meaning to it, but it is the craft itself that you're there to appreciate. But I think that people can take some pride in their beliefs, and I think that they can bring
Mhm.
that to their art in a way that doesn't need to be lampooned as childish and contemporary, and this whatever we see the art student act like in college, which is another joke, right? I think that you can approach it and understand that it is a very well tested and historical ambition to want to change the world with your art. And I don't think it's childish. I don't think that anybody needs to ask permission to do
Yeah.
that. And I think that the people that did end up doing that very oftentimes were not the elite, and they were not the privileged. They were not, those that felt they had the right to control the world. They were the ones that were convicted and saw something deeply wrong, or that they believed in with conviction, and that these traditional tools, if you ask me, are probably the greatest way to actually connect with that if you're talking about this kind of emotional persuasion, because I think that they are very deeply linked to the sensory experience of looking at something and how we believe in something because we're looking at it. And it might sound really simple, but just consider how much of our lives is based on the belief of what we see. And if that could be a part of the work that you're making,
80% of our information comes through the eyes in the end, and that's the most important
exactly.
sensory organ.
And if that can be a part of the work you're making, the meaning that you're imbuing into that work, which I also hope is ambitious and full of all sorts of positive things for the world, then your communication has been amplified. It is greater because of it. So it's really that connection between communication and traditional craft that I think I would just stress ad nauseum, and that ability to create the illusion is so important. And it's not necessarily something that people care as much about from a contemporary perspective as much as we might think of it as kind of like a more of a graphic kind of pattern where it might be representational, but it's kind of built on the language of photography. And I think that it's worth acknowledging, painters made photography. We did it. And a lot of the early photographers were painters. Look at Delacroix, for instance. He was doing lots of stuff with that. I think Rodin as well.
And I think a lot of the people that I talk to, they have this hopelessness when they look around, because you have so much noise. Most of the social media
and it's all garbage.
Industry,
it's all garbage.
It's just noise. But then at the same time, we have this incredible, unprecedented opportunities to have access to the craft in so many ways we're probably not aware of. You have New Masters Academy. We still have European academies that perpetuate this cumulated, because it's a cumulus, it's a sum of human experience and knowledge, trial and error. And that's what traditional craft means. It's all of this that started from let's say the classical Greeks, the archaic period, the classical Greeks, Hellenistic period, and then Renaissance, and all the way into the 20th century. And when I study classical Odyssey, by classicism, I mean something that is universal.
Yeah.
You have the dictionary.
And that's what we connected on, I think, is that, originally I thought this was going to be like,
it's proven and tested by time.
Which is your favorite ancient Greece? But I think that we ended up connecting a lot more on, literally just the idea of believing in something and using that to really fuel what it is you do with the arts. And I think that is lacking, I think, in a lot of visual arts specifically. And if it is present in visual arts, it's often the craft that's lacking, which is why I was, that connection is what's so important to me.
Wow.
Because that's what I think is the grounds for the change that I was talking about, and at least my moral foundation or moral motivation for the arts. And again, for a lot of people, they find that kind of a saccharine, or it's too quixotic or something, like idealistic. But it's who I am, and I grew up on superhero comics. I want to save the world.
That is amazing. That is amazing.
So. I would give everybody, if I can give anybody the responsibility, or not responsibility, but the privilege, I don't know that I can, but if I can give anybody anything, I would say just have some pride, and don't be afraid to make those big statements, because I think making those statements and really believing in them is what's going to motivate you to work harder, and it's going to motivate you to achieve those things that you think might not be possible, but you probably want to be possible.